I was born in Cherokee, Iowa. I have two sisters, an older sister and a younger sister. We are each 2 years apart. When my mother came from Storm Lake, Iowa, which was just about an hour from where we lived in Cherokee. My dad was born in Nebraska. He had become the veterinarian in Storm Lake, and that's how my mother met him. So now they've moved to Cherokee, and I was born in a little house out on Spruce Street. But by the time I was 1, my dad, being a veterinarian, had bought a house down a block from the center of town in Cherokee, Iowa. It was a 2-story house, 3 bedrooms. All 3 bedrooms were upstairs. My youngest sister and I shared a bedroom. My older sister had a bedroom to herself. Then Mother and Daddy had the other bedroom. I went to an elementary school that was about 3 blocks from the house. We walked to school. I went to kindergarten. I went all day to kindergarten. I walked home at lunchtime. Mother didn't work. She just stayed home and took care of us kids. But she had our lunches every day, because every day we didn't have school lunches back then. So I walked home for lunch, and we must have had an hour to walk home, eat, and get back to school. When I was in kindergarten, I can remember that I didn't have much sense on time. And after school, instead of going straight home, I would find somebody to play with on the way home. And then I didn't get home till several hours later. And my mother would be so upset with me. Well, on the back of the dining room door hung a razor strap that belonged to my dad. He would sharpen his razor on the razor strap. It made a very good whipping switch, and I got it periodically, but it really didn't seem to do much good because I still couldn't remember to come home. And I wasn't being bad, I just found somebody to play with on the way home because we walked back and forth to school. My dad was a veterinarian. There were 5 veterinarians in the family. I had 2 uncles who were also veterinarians in neighboring little towns, and then I had 2 cousins that became veterinarians. I was too small to go on calls with Daddy, but by the time our cousin Dean had graduated from veterinary school, he took over Daddy's practice in Cherokee, and Daddy and his brothers opened up a rendering plant on my Uncle Warren's farm about 12 miles in Quimby, Ohio, from us. So by the time I was old enough to go on calls, I mainly went with my cousin Dean. My dad and his brothers were down at the plant all day. The war broke out in 1942. I can remember when Pearl Harbor was bombed. I can remember the rationing stamps, and because Daddy drove back and forth, he had a B sticker. Mother had an A sticker. But Daddy didn't come home during the week, because he stayed in Quimby, so he didn't have to drive so much. Some people had telephones back when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, but not everybody. We had a private line because Mother took calls for the rendering plant, and she would keep a pad by the phone with the calls on it, and the drivers of the trucks would stop and pick up the calls. Occasionally I would ride to Quimby with one of them, hang out at the rendering plant, and come back with Daddy that night. The house that we lived in was a 2-story house, 3 bedrooms upstairs. My younger sister and I shared a bedroom. My older sister had a bedroom by herself, and Mother and Daddy had a room. In growing up, we lived close to Spring Lake. That's where we went swimming in the summertime. And every once in a while, my older sister, Clara, would come in and say, "Come on, Joanne, get up, let's go on a hike before school." So I'd crawl out of bed, we'd walk down to Spring Lake, hike around the lake, stop and build a fire, eat our breakfast, come home, get ready and go to school. And we did that really quite often. We did lots of hiking back in those days. I had a bicycle, but we would hike out to Pilot Rock, which is a huge rock about the size of a small house that the glaciers deposited when the glaciers went down through the plains. Then sometimes we'd go in the other direction to a little creek that ran out that way. But we did lots of hiking back in those days. When I was in the 2nd grade, during the summer, the Cherokee Times offered me a paper route and I took it. I thought I was in heaven. I would deliver every night and I made 98 cents a week. That was a lot of money for me. Now, when I would go to the movies, which he had one movie house 1 block from us, and the other movie house was 2 blocks from us. And I could go to the movies every night for 10 cents and buy a bag of popcorn for a nickel. And after school started, as long as I was working, Mother made me buy savings stamps. We bought them at school, and when we would go to school, we would fill out a book. When the book became full, there was enough stamps to buy a bond. I kept my paper route until that winter. Then Mother made me quit. But the following summer, a man from the Sioux City Journal stopped by, and one of the boys in the neighborhood was giving up his route, and I took it. That was 7 days a week. But now I made $3.60 a week, so I could buy lots of stamps now. Mother made me save half of what I made, so I learned to save and spend. Coming home at the end of that route was a grocery store. They sold hot dogs. So every night I would stop and buy a hot dog. I think it cost me a dime. It might have been a nickel, but I think it was a dime. Once in a while, Mother would go play cards at noon. When that happened, she would give me 15 cents to go and buy me a hamburger and a Coke. We were not allowed to drink Coke, so it had to be an orange or a grape that I would buy. And the little restaurant was just a block from the school. I thought I was in heaven when I could walk up, sit at the booth, order a hamburger and a drink for 15 cents. When I was about 10, 12 years old, my father began to have a problem with double vision. And he was still working down at the plant, but one day he didn't have full control of his walking. He kind of staggered. A lot of people thought he was drunk, but my father never drank. And one day, winter day, he was down at the plant, the ground was frozen, and he stumbled and fell and broke his kneecap. And at that time, he was laid up at home, and he was reading books. And there was a movie that had come out with Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift in it, that apparently Daddy was reading the book. And the movie wasn't quite as intense as the book was. But Daddy would not let us go see the movie because of the sex scenes that were in the book and not particularly in the movie. But then he didn't know that. And after he recuperated from that, he decided it was time to go to the doctors and see what was wrong with him. Of course, the little doctor in our town didn't have time for one patient that he had no idea what was wrong with him. So Daddy decided to go to Omaha to the doctors down there. I had a skin problem, and so they took me to Omaha to a skin specialist, and in looking me over, the doctor said that he could do surgery on me. So they scheduled me for surgery, but they could never give Daddy any satisfaction. After we get to Omaha, he then got an appointment at the Mayo Clinic. And after he went to the Mayo Clinic, they diagnosed him with multiple sclerosis. Now, nobody had ever heard of it, my father included. But since he was a veterinarian and the doctor didn't have time for one case of something he'd never heard of, he ordered all the information, and in reading it, Daddy discovered the people that had MS went to Florida, and the warm climate seemed to help them. So I was a freshman in high school, and that summer, before my freshman year, I had gone to California to visit a friend for 6 weeks. And Daddy left for Florida before I got back. He came home for Thanksgiving, but didn't stay but overnight because the cold weather didn't agree with him. So he went back to Florida, and he didn't like large cities. And back in those days, Miami was Florida. Well, he found a little cabin along the west coast with some idle cars, and he stopped at it. And then he went back down, he stopped again. While he was there, somebody told him about Warm Mineral Springs, which was just 12 miles outside of Venice. So he started going to Warm Mineral Springs. The temperature of the water was 87, the year round, full of minerals, very buoyant. There was a big hole in the center of the pond that nobody had found the bottom to. And I don't know whether they found the bottom to this day. But it was very full of mineral stuff to high heaven because it was sulfur water. But Daddy could swim in, and the exercise of swimming, he could walk out where he would have to be in a wheelchair or cane when he walked in. So that's why after the summer we spent down there, so we could all be together. My older sister, was a senior in high school. I was going to be a sophomore, my younger sister in the 8th grade. We decided to move down there. And we came home one night from spending all summer down there. And my older sister said, "It wouldn't be so bad to move down here." Mother said Daddy had been saying the same thing. He didn't want to see us leave. She said, "But I won't come down unless I've got a house to live in." So we went to Venice the next day and bought a house. Daddy paid $12,000 for the house. It was 2 blocks from the Gulf of Mexico. We were basically on the edge of the residential section back then, 2 blocks from the center of town, which Venice was a very small place back then. That's how we ended up in Florida. We went back to Iowa, had a '39 Ford, loaded it up with us 3 girls, mother, and anything else we could put in, brooms, mops, what clothes we could get in of all 4 of us, and moved to Florida. That was the beginning of our Florida days. Now this school I went to in Florida, there were 36 in our graduating class, one class of 36. The class behind us had 16 in their graduating class. Clara's class had 15 in their graduating class, of which Clara was valedictorian. The first day of school, the teacher was about 6 foot tall and not fat, but heavy, but of a large built person. And she was a fist pounder. And she liked the boys. And of course, I didn't know her. I'd never been to Florida before. So she said to me, "Are you from Iowa?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And her fist came down on the desk, bang. She looks at me and she says, "Yes, ma'am." Boy, I yes ma'am'd it from then on. Right then and there, she took a great disliking to me. But then, I suppose they had good reason to. I was my mother's worst nightmare. I was always doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. But there were a bunch of us girls that ran around together at school. We called us Dirty Dozen because it was 13 of us. And we were always going to the beach, doing nothing bad, just always together doing things. Like, for instance, one day at noontime, we're sitting out under the flagpole, and the sun is shining, and a couple of the boys, when we were juniors, I think, had cars, one of them being the principal's son. So we decided all to pile in the cars and go to the beach. Principal didn't think too much of that, but especially since his son was with us. But we were always doing something like that. When I was a senior in high school, the MGM, I believe it came to Sarasota to make a movie at the circus grounds. So Mother always said, "No, don't expect me to sign your excuses." But that day, my friend's mother and Dad were chefs at the yacht club. And so the movie stars had given them passes to get down in the filming of The Greatest Show on Earth. So we couldn't very well turn that down. So, there's like 6 of us didn't show up for school that day. But we were right down on the filming of a scene in that movie. That was so interesting. Then later, the end of the movie, they have an accident and the parade goes through town. Well, the girls, we were all Mariner Scouts. So we donned our little blue uniforms, and Sarasota had a 5 points. And we had to make a human chain of us Girl Scouts so the circus could go by. Then we followed the circus out of town, and in the movie, you can see this row of girls in blue uniforms. Well, I'm one of them. I'm not sure which one, but I'm one of them. And my friend and I would watch that movie and comment on it. years later when I would go to visit her. But the high school years were really awesome down there. We spent a lot of the time at the beach. There was nothing on the beach at that time. One night we decided we would go skinny dipping. Now my mother was not a very disciplined person, I guess, because she'd be playing bridge and we'd go and say, well, we're going swimming tonight. And she later told us that the ladies there had a fit to think that she would let us go swimming at night. But we did it all the time. And so this one night, nobody was on the beach, but there was one couple walking on the beach. Well, we waited for them to leave and they didn't leave. Finally, when the girls went up to ask them when they were leaving, they said we wanted to go swimming. Oh, they said, you want us to stay and watch you? Yeah, that's what we wanted. So we never did go skinny dipping, but we went swimming. During the winter months in Venice, the Kentucky Military Institute wintered in Venice. So during January, February, and March, we had 360 freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior high school students roaming our streets. Goodness knows the girls never had a trouble getting a date back then. The local guys weren't too crazy about when the cadets came to town. But us girls had a blast. When I was a senior in high school, and we're getting ready for graduation, one of my friends wanted to go to Louisville to their dance. So she talked me into going with her. The guy that I'd been going with at KMI also invited me to go. So we had to miss our baccalaureate night of our graduation, and we hopped a plane and came to Louisville for the dance. The guy I was going with was some other national, and I do not remember what it was. But I do remember that I ate dinner at his house, and the food was all very strange. I felt like a fish out of water and wondered what in the world I was doing there. But Jane Ann wanted to come, so we went. After graduation, my mother wanted me to go to college for at least 1 year, so I told her I would. My older sister, Clara, had been studying music at a college in Iowa, but she decided to transfer to the University of Florida since I was going there. So I went to college for a year, just like she wanted me to, and then I went to beauty school. I really didn't like college. I'm not a student, a good student. And I wanted to do something. So I decided, okay, I would go to beauty school. If I didn't like that, I'd do something else. But beauty school was really, after college, very easy. And I liked it. And that really worked out well for me. I later went back to Venice to work, and when the cadets were down there with their families, there was a lot of work. But after they left, there was no work. So the first summer I went to Virginia Beach, and there was an Army base at Virginia Beach, and I dated some of the guys from there. Well, one of the guys from there was from Waynesville, Ohio. Then later when I came to Ohio, he brought a friend down with him to visit me. And I didn't hear any more from them for a long time. Then one day the friend called and was bringing a friend. And the friend that he brought took a liking to me, and he just kept coming back down. Well, I ended up marrying him. And I went out and I met his mother. He had one brother and 4 sisters. And he was the oldest, and his brother was the youngest. His dad had died while he was in the service, and his younger brother was just a year old. So after we got married, we bought a farm in New Vienna, and Frank then came down and spent the summers with us and helped on the farm. And we were married about 5 years before I had any children that lived. I had 2 before that. One was a miscarriage and one was a stillborn. But by the time Carolyn came along, maybe the doctors were better, I don't know. But anyway, I had Carolyn 1 year, then I had Ben the next year, then I waited a couple of years and had Regina, and I had 3 under 3 for a short period of time. But if I had to do it over again, I would do it over. The kids grew up together. The farm was a great place to raise them. The kids got along, and I opened up a beauty shop in my house. And in the first year or so, I didn't have much business. I didn't need much. But one by one, people started coming. And it didn't take long, and I was busy as I needed to be. Always was. The kids were great. I could raise the kids, fix the meals, and work in the shop also. And then when Carolyn was 10 years old, I got pregnant again. And Carolyn was so excited. The other 2 didn't express their wishes too much. And when it came time to have Hazel, she was due in December. So over Christmas holiday, Tony, Larry, and the kids all came to visit, to be there when she was born. But she didn't come. She didn't come until the 14th of January. Oh, I know she was a 10-month baby. But we were expecting her around the 14th of December. That was her due date. And when she finally got here, there were no x-rays or anything back in those days. And I would go to the doctor, and the doctor would say, baby is small. When baby gets ready to come, baby will come. Sure enough, she was very little, but she came and she was very healthy, and the kids adored her. Carolyn took her everywhere with her. Carolyn took care of her. And Ben was the best babysitter. He just hoovered over her. If we go to Dayton shopping, Hazel would be in the stroller. If somebody came up and if they went to touch her, Ben would slap their hands away. But she was very much loved by everybody. After 27 years of marriage, I divorced my husband, and Hazel and I moved to a little house on 28. There was a barn. Hazel had a horse, so we got a house with a barn next to it. I can remember taking Hazel to college that day. We had gone to Dayton. We unloaded her, got her settled in her room, and then I left. And they had a meeting for the parents, I guess. And suddenly I thought, you know, she's gone. I'm not gonna have Hazel ever again. I cried all the way home. That was probably the worst day of my life, was taking her to college and dropping her off and knowing she would never, ever be back home again. In growing up, Hazel and Marcia were like sisters. And I was divorced, and the next year, Donna's husband, Clarence, had passed away. So during those years, Hazel, myself, Donna, and Marcia did lots of things together. Donna and I belonged to the same Mother's Club in the same church. So we took Hazel and Marcia to places like the Fenton factory, took them to Gatlinburg one weekend, and they grew up like sisters. After I dropped Hazel off at college, I went back home and I had the beauty shop in my house. So I just kept busy working. I was active in the church community, and I was I played cards with just a group, but we played, I think, just once a month. Then, several years later, Carolyn is married, and Regina are married, and they want me to buy a condo down by close to where they are. So I still had the beauty shop out in the country, and I bought the condo. Shortly after I bought the condo, I got sick. I came down with temporary arteritis, which was the condo was a godsend because I don't know what I would have done without it. Carolyn had just become a mother for the second time. She adopted 2 boys. All 3 of her boys are adopted. But the second one was a premature boy. And he was only a week old when I got so sick. But the kids took care of me. And eventually I sold the beauty shop and the house in the country and moved down to the condo altogether. Then I got active and I was substituting at school, working at Kings Island in the summer. And I loved both jobs. And I worked both jobs until COVID came along. And when COVID came along, I contacted COVID. Was really sick for about a week with COVID. I was in the hospital. Then I was in the hospital with pneumonia. And I never fully recovered from the COVID. It left me with a cough. And, but I have always enjoyed my grandkids. They were my life forever. Shortly after I was divorced, I became a grandmother for the first time. Ben and got married just before I was divorced, and they had a little girl, Larkin. Then later they had Trey, but after they had Trey, Regina had gotten married, and they had Graham, and then Luke. And I devoted as much time as I could to the grandkids. But I was still working 2 jobs, and then I decided to get in a group that played cards at the Y. And at my older age, I devoted most of my time to playing cards after I could no longer work. I had dated a guy named Jim Grimm, who was Carolyn's uncle, Earth's uncle. And I dated him for 20 years. But then once I quit working, I moved down totally in Cincinnati. And he lived in Washington Courthouse. There was too big a difference. I started playing cards at the Y, met a guy there that had lost his wife after 36 60 years. And he and I worked up a refrain, worked up a very good relationship. And that's where I am today. I play cards about 4 times a week. And John and I eat dinner every evening, watch TV. I go home, he stays home, or if he goes to my house, he goes home. We like that arrangement really well. Well, John is very considerate, a very complimentary guy, which I was not used to at all. We think a lot alike and we enjoy doing things together. He never gets mad at me. He's getting older. It's harder for him to go a lot of places, so if I'm going to the kids, I a lot of times go along, only because it's harder for him to get around these days. I am 90 now and he is 94. His birthday is in June. This is February, so he'll be 95 in June. I'll be 91 in May. Back when I was first divorced, a friend of mine was the leader of a senior citizen in New Vienna, and she was planning a cruise for her people. Invited me to go with her, since her husband didn't want to go with her. And that was my first cruise, my first vacation of any size, and it was such a wonderful trip. Not only did I have a great time on the cruise, but I met a lot of my neighbors at that time, because I had just moved to Fort 28 and didn't really know the immediate neighbors very well. Then later, my friend Donna and I did lots of traveling together. And then Wilma started going with us, and the 3 of us, every 6 or 8 months, were going off to Gatlinburg, or on a little cruise to Nassau, or someplace. Donna wanted to go to Alaska, but I had come down with temporal arteritis until I told her the next year I would go. But I wasn't able to go, so she went without me. But later, she wanted to take a cruise along the eastern shore. We got on in Canada, got off in New York, and I went on that cruise with her. We had the best time. We laughed and we carried them. One night, about 11 o'clock, for some reason, we were in our night pajamas, and we went out the door. I don't know if one of us was out, the other one came out. Donna looks at me and she says, "Do you have a key?" I said, "No." And there we are, 11 o'clock at night, outside our door, not able to get back in, not a soul around. Well, we couldn't go down to look for somebody because we were in our pajamas. And we just laughed and laughed and laughed. Finally, somebody came along and we got us somebody, but it opened our door for us. But Donna and I had lots of good memories traveling together. Oh, I've always been a firm believer, and I've always been a firm believer that God got me through all the rough spots of my marriage. And not only that, I prayed for my kids continually. And I'm sure that it's God's hand that the kids grew up to be as successful as they were. I can remember one morning, Regina, the night before, had gone to Columbus, And about 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up and I was praying for her that she would have a safe trip home, have a good time. The next morning, Regina came down and she says, "Mom, the strangest thing happened last night." She said, "I was coming out of Columbus and I needed gas and all I had was a check. And the first filling station I stopped at wouldn't take a check." And she says, "I didn't know what I was going to do." And finally stopped at another filling station. And she said there was an elderly man there. And he took her check. And I thought, that's about when I was praying for you. When Ben was about 6 or 7 years old, maybe, he was always climbing trees. And I was always praying for him. One day the neighbor came home and said that she doesn't know how she missed him. He was in the center of the road playing. She came up over a little hill. And she said, "I closed my eyes. And when I opened them and looked back, he was in the ditch playing." Now I know God had to move him out of that road. And I always contribute that Ben's livelihood had to do with God. I always prayed for all of the kids every night when they were growing up. One of the most difficult things in my life would be when I was pregnant the first time. Of course, I really didn't know much about pregnancy. For that matter, I didn't know much about anything. I was brought up very naive and trusted everybody. And in losing the first miscarriage, I had no idea what was going on with that. Then I got pregnant the second time, and in my mind, I knew something wasn't right. But the doctors didn't know anything back in those days. And it wasn't until I was in labor that the doctor was concerned about it. And that was a stillborn. But having not had any kids, and it wasn't right, the baby wouldn't have been right, I didn't really grieve that much about it. And I thought to myself, maybe I'm just not into motherhood, but I still feel like that was the best thing. And then I went on and I had 4 healthy children. And I thought my way of thinking was a good way to think on that. But that was probably one of the most difficult times. And then when Trey came along and he became addicted to drugs, I worried so about him. And when he finally passed away, it was so devastating. It was such a young life lost. But Trey was never a happy person. And I'm sure he's happy where he is. Oh, I suppose one of the most influential people in my life would be my English teacher, whom I said didn't like me. But I learned more from her, respected her, because I could understand her way of teaching, and I just seemed like I learned so much from her. My mother never liked anything I did. I don't think I could please her with anything I did. My father was never a loving person. That just wasn't the nature of the Simonsons. I don't think they ever showed any affection, any of them that I know of. My friend Donna was probably one of the most influential people in my life because we did so much together, And she was such a great role model with her faith, and there was no it was all so positive in her life. Even when her husband was so sick, I think we supported each other through our bad times. Although when Clarence passed away, her husband Clarence, I wasn't there. I was in Florida, I believe, visiting my sister Tony. Some of the important lessons I think I've learned in life is even though you're not as the most intelligent person, if you are willing to work, you will get along in this life. And I was never good at schoolwork, but I loved to work. I may not ever been successful in anything, but I worked hard at everything I did. From my paper routes I had as a kid to being a hairdresser, being a teacher, being a substitute teacher for almost 30 years. When I first started substituting, I felt like such a failure. So I worked on it until I said I wanted to be a substitute that the teachers say, I want her to sub for me. And I believe that day came more than once when somebody would say, I want you to substitute for me. I really tried hard to be the best of what I can be, even though I'm not the most intelligent person. Well, I lived through the beginning of World War II and the ending of World War II, but I was so young that I can't say it made a big impression on me. Roosevelt was the president, and of course my mother never liked Roosevelt. And of course I remember the ending of the Second World War by the picture of a sailor kissing some lady. That picture is still famous today. And I definitely remember when that came out. I remember when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. The night we went over, my husband, Carolyn, myself, went to Bill and Becky Schubert's that night to watch it on television. And I remember him walking on the moon. Later, I could hear comments in the beauty shop that, well, maybe he didn't really walk on the moon. But I always would hear negative comments when something historical happened like that. When we were first married, Gene worked for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And he invited one of the scientists to come for dinner one Sunday. And he and his wife came. They had kids in high school. I didn't have any children yet, so I didn't have much in common with her. But this was at the same time that the Russians put Sputnik in the orbit, and they were watching Sputnik. And that's all this talk, everything at the dinner table was Sputnik. That was a very memorable time, because I often wondered, I wonder what the future has in store for us. And then when they started orbiting the Earth, and all that was always televised, I never did get to Cape Canaveral to watch a shuttle go up. But years later, I got to go to Lake Canaveral to see the launch pad and things. My sister Tony and her husband lived in Florida, and they would go up and camp when the shuttles would take off. And I always thought that was so exciting to do. One day I was giving a perm to my neighbor, and Jean was out in the field plowing close to the house. And we had the TV on because she liked to watch the soap operas. And they broke into the TV station and said John F. Kennedy had been killed in Texas. And I go running out the house, forgetting I got a perm processing, and to tell Gene. And when I told him, he put his head in his hands and says, "Oh my goodness, I don't know what that's going to mean." He apparently was very concerned about what was going to happen since we had no president. I got back in the house, oh, I better pay attention to what I'm doing. But at least everything turned out okay with the perm, as far as I can remember. But I definitely remember when that came on the TV. And at the happening of it, I remember the funeral of JFK, watching that on television. Then a couple of years later, Bobby Kennedy was running for president. And that was also at the time Martin Luther King was killed. And at the time Martin Luther King was killed, I remember Bobby Kennedy talking to the American people because he had also lost a brother. And I thought, if anybody's going to keep this country from a civil war or something, Bobby Kennedy can do it. And I thought, I will vote for him if he runs. But before that time came, they assassinated him also, which I was devastated. When that happened, I had no idea what was going to happen. They were assassinating people right and left. I was quite a moviegoer. I loved the movies. Just before we moved to Florida, I got a job as an usher at the movie theater. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And one of the movies they were showing at that time was Annie, Get Your Gun. Well, of course, by the time I ushered a few days in that, I knew all the songs. I loved that movie. Of course, being in The Greatest Show on Earth, that is a great movie to begin with. I love the circus. The circus was a great thing at that time. It's too bad they don't have it anymore. And as I grew older, I can remember the first taping I did. And I just taped one movie after another. And one night I watched a movie which became my favorite movie. It's an old black and white movie with Orson Welles and Claudette Colbert. It's called Tomorrow is Forever. I taped it and I've watched it dozens of times. One day, Regina decided to watch it with me, but she said she didn't like it. She didn't like the ending of it. Well, I thought it was great. I still do. That's probably my favorite. But I have lots of movies that I really enjoy. The Ten Commandments was a phenomenal movie. Shortly after I was married, I talked you into my husband taking me to see a musical. That wasn't his thing. And later I wanted him to take me to see the Ten Commandments. And he informed me he would take me, but if we got there and it was as bad as the last movie, he was walking out. Well, when the Ten Commandments was first at the theater, there was a 20-minute intermission. It was so long, but he never walked out of it. I think he truly enjoyed the Ten Commandments. Some of the dances that they did when I grew up were the jitterbug, and I was never coordinated enough to learn to do the jitterbug. I could do the two-step, the waltz. Somewhere along the line, I learned a polka. I have a nephew that got married in California. When I went out to his wedding, he had a German band playing, and I could polka. And I can remember dancing with Clara's son, and he says, well, Aunt Joanne, where did you learn to polka? You know, I guess I've always known how to polka, but I could polka, and I had the best time. I mentioned when I was very, very young, most people didn't have telephones. And some of them that had telephones were on party lines. And it was, their phone was like a big wooden box on the wall with a handle on the side to turn. And they would have to turn 1 or 2 or 3 rings to get somebody on their party line. And if their ring was 3, then they didn't answer the phone. All the rings would come into their house. I remember that phone. Now, like I say, we had a private line, so I wasn't in on any of that until we moved to the farm. And we didn't have a phone for a while out there. When we did get one, at one point in time, they put us on a party line when the very first computers came out. And my friend, Nancy Henderson, went to school, took a class on working with them, and she got a job working with the very first computers, which took up a whole room. And I can remember the first calculators coming out. One of my customers came in and was telling me that her son was a person that worked at Churchill Downs, and at Churchill Downs, they had a contraption that would add and subtract and divide and multiply forward. That was the first calculators that came out. When I was a very young girl, down in the 1st, 2nd grade of school, we had stick pens that we learned to write with. There was a pen point put in a container of a point, and we dipped that into the ink bottle, and then you would write a couple of words and dip it again and write again. And I can remember the very first ballpoint pen that came out. Oh my, it was such a great invention. Before that, they had what they called a fountain pen, and you would fill the pen with ink, but it would sometimes blot out. They also had ink blotters, but when the ballpoint pen came out, I think I was probably in the 3rd or 4th grade, and we bought Daddy one for Christmas or Father's Day sometime. We all went together and paid, I think, $200 for it, which back in those days, $200 would be more like $2,000. Oh yeah, and we bought him a ballpoint pen. We did not have television until after I left home. When I was a senior in high school, our class took a trip to New York. And while we were there, I saw my first television set. But televisions, there were no studios in Florida at that time, or stations. Anyway, the very first TV I came in contact with, I went to beauty school in Bradenton, and I went to live with one of the girls I was in beauty school. They had a TV, and I was so excited. And every night I could watch I Love Lucy. That's the only thing I remember that was on. They always had lots of fights on, but Lucy was on, and I watched her. That would be in 1953. When I was growing up, we had radio. And we had radio programs like you have TV programs. And we knew what radio shows were on Sunday night. And we would listen to them. And they were people talking. And then you used your imagination. If they were in a house and walking, and you could hear the sound of them walking, you would visualize what they were doing. Same way when I read a book, I visualize what the room looks like. One day I was in school and I asked the students if they visualized when they were reading a book, and they had no idea what I was talking about. Because when you have radio, you had to visualize what was going on. And so many people that were very famous on the radio didn't make it in television because they weren't photogenic enough to have their looks go with their voices. But you knew who somebody was by their voices. We listened to the great Gildersleeve. Well, you knew immediately who you were listening to. Or Jack Benny. Jack Benny had a black butler, Rochester, and you always knew when Rochester was speaking, or when Jack Benny was speaking, or their wives were speaking, by the description that was made of where they were at. And that was a very unique time that our radio shows are like your television shows are today, except we had to visualize what that was all like. But we had our paper that was printed in the Daily News of the shows that would be on that night and what the week they were. When I was growing up, we had a program called the Hit Parade. And every week they had the top songs that were being played in the country. And we listened to that, the Hit Parade. And there were lots of musical shows also on where you listened to the songs and we sang them and played them on the piano. I want to be remembered for my positive attitude. I've always tried to be positive. And one of my famous words are awesome. When I would go to school and somebody would ask me how I was, I would always say awesome. And I would say, and how are you? And if they would say, the principal would say, I'm good, I would say, no. If I'm awesome, you have to be awesome. And they would smile and say, then I guess I'm awesome. I just hope that I lifted somebody's spirits up throughout my lifetime by being positive. I don't try to be negative. I don't like negative people. So no matter what I am doing, I like to be doing it. No matter who I meet, I like them. No matter what they are, I like what they're doing because I don't want to be negative.